When I was 19 years old, I dropped out of college after doing 1.5 semesters. And the reason why I dropped out of college at the time, to make a long story short, is because I did not want to work a 9-to-5. I simply didn't see the 9-to-5 lifestyle in my future. That's no shade to anybody who works a 9-to-5. If you work a 9-to-5, then hey, that's great. We do need 9-to-5 workers for society to function. However, we also need entrepreneurs for society to function. And I decided at an early age that I wanted to be in the latter group. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. But to be completely honest with you, I do believe in retrospect that my decision was made in large part because of American workplace culture. And bearing that in mind, in this video, I want to talk about some of the areas in which American workplace culture are behind the European workplace culture. And of course, I didn't know any of this when I dropped out, by the way. Had I known this, it's possible that I would have stayed in college and actually pursued the 9-to-5 route, but simply chose to go to Europe instead. But of course, hindsight's 20/20, and I like making a living doing this. That said, the first aspect of American workplace culture that just absolutely sucks, in my opinion, from the outside looking in, is at-will employment. So here in the US, if you weren't aware, basically everybody who works, at least unless you're an independent contractor, everybody who works a traditional 9-to-5 as an employee is what is known as an at-will employee working for an at-will employer. Basically, what this means in a nutshell is that they have the ability to fire you at any given time for generally any given reason. Of course, if the reason is tied to discrimination in any way, shape, or form, that could lead to lawsuits. But generally speaking, it is at their discretion to decide if you will work for their company or not. And of course, this can be very, very problematic, because you can be in a situation where maybe you're paying for your house, your mortgage, or your rent. You might have a couple of cars, because obviously here in the US, you pretty much need a car or multiple cars to function as an adult and even get a job. And you might even have kids to support. And suddenly, one day, you just don't have your job anymore. And I know this because this has happened to one of my parents before. There have been at least 1 or 2 times where my mom would come wake me up in the morning to tell me that she was not going into work that day, and she wouldn't be going into work for the foreseeable future because she had been laid off. And as a kid, I didn't really understand what that meant. But of course, as you get older, you come to realize that that's because some of these companies no longer have the revenue to pay their staff or to incur all of the expenses that they're incurring. Therefore, they have to cut costs. As an entrepreneur, I understand this because I've had to, quote unquote, lay people off as well, even though those people weren't actually employees, they were independent contractors. The point that I'm making is that here in the US, business owners have a right to do that. They can literally just lay you off with no prior warning. And this is absolutely catastrophic. This right here is honestly, I think, the biggest reason why I was able to convince myself to pursue the unstable entrepreneurial route. Because what I realized when I was young, seeing my mom get laid off from her job and being a good worker at that, is that, look, maybe entrepreneurship is unstable, there's income volatility, but at the same time, you can get fired from your job. And you want to talk about income volatility, you can go from making whatever it is you're making to making zero. No severance pay, no nothing. So thankfully, in those situations, my dad was able to cover whatever money she wasn't making anymore. But imagine if he hadn't been able to cover that. What would we have done? A lot of Americans still don't have the answer to that question, and they are struggling. Now, in Europe, this is something that I didn't know, by the way. I literally did not know this until I moved to the Netherlands and talked to some of my girlfriend's family members who all work 9-to-5s. In Europe, there is no such thing as at-will employment, at least in the Netherlands. I don't know about other European countries, but I imagine that in the entirety of the European Union, at least, everybody is under contract. So what this means is that whenever they hire you for a specific term. It might be 6 months, 12 months, so on and so forth. And once your term ends, they then have the option to renew your contract. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. Oftentimes, I guess they do if you're a good worker. But the point is, they can't just lay you off with no prior notice. And I imagine that as a 9-to-5 worker, this contributes substantially to your overall peace of mind and mental well-being. I have to imagine, because look, as an entrepreneur, of course, I am very, very familiar with the uncertainty of tomorrow, of what tomorrow may bring. But at the very least, I know without a shadow of a doubt that I'm going to make money tomorrow. It may be less than today, it might be more than today, but I'm going to make something. And when you're under contract, you know without a shadow of a doubt that until this term ends, I am going to be making money. I'm going to be making X amount of money. And that stability really does contribute to peace of mind. Of course, as an entrepreneur, again, I don't really get that. I don't really have that privilege, but I'm also a little bit crazy. I'm wired differently. To be an entrepreneur, you have to be wired differently, but that's besides the point. Here in the US, you can get laid off, you can get fired, and you just don't make money. But the rent, the car note, all of that is still due. So that's definitely something that deterred me from pursuing the 9-to-5 path when I was younger. Now, another thing that makes workplace culture in the US inferior to workplace culture in Europe, in my opinion, is here in the US, the standard vacation time is around 2 weeks. And honestly, I think that might be a little bit generous. I want to say it could be anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks per year. And I do believe that this is paid vacation. I could be completely wrong about that. But generally, if you're working a salaried position, you're gonna get around 1 to 2 weeks of paid vacation per year. And honestly, that is horrifying. That is absolutely horrifying. And that right there used to scare the living shit out of me. Pardon my French, but that used to scare the living shit out of me when I was in college, just sort of future pacing, just imagining how my future would unfold. The idea that I would only have 1 to 2 weeks per year to travel and to just decompress. I mean, that just sounds absolutely horrible. In Europe, in most European countries that I'm familiar with, at least, especially the Netherlands, I believe the standard is anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks per year. Now, you might be thinking, well, Jordan, that's actually not that big of a difference. It's only 2 extra weeks. But here's the thing. Okay, 2 weeks doesn't sound like a long time, although of course it is, but even if it doesn't sound like a long time, when you extrapolate that out over a long time horizon, so 2 weeks times, let's say your average work career is about 40 years. Let's say you start working at 25 and you retire at 65. 40 years, 2 extra weeks for 40 years straight. 40 times 2, okay, I dropped out of college, but I still know basic math. That is 80 weeks. 80 extra weeks of vacation over your working career. That is literally over a year. Really, that's almost about what? A year and a half, 2 years. That is a lot of extra time. You get a whole extra year of vacation time over the course of your career. Here in the US, vacation time is very limited, and actually, it's my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, because I do hope that I'm wrong about this, but it's my understanding that companies are not required by federal law to give you paid vacation. They're actually not legally required to do that. The only reason why they do it is so that they can have a competitive offer for their prospects. Please excuse the wind noise, by the way. If you can hear wind noise, I apologize. I obviously can't control that. But honestly, again, being a college student, being 19 years old at the time, just the idea of only having 2 weeks per year, and I guess the weekends or whatever other random holidays you might get, that was mortifying to me. It was mortifying, and I honestly don't know why people accept this. I really don't. I mean, there has to be some sort of way that people can protest or do something. I don't know. Again, I chose my path. I chose my way of quote-unquote protesting this. But this is something that I don't know if Americans just don't know, if they're just not aware that people in Europe are really taking multiple 2-week vacations per year. And of course, the structure of people's vacations might differ based on the jobs that they have. But based on observing my girlfriend's family, the way that they seem to do it was they would take their vacations in 1 to 2 week increments. So they would have multiple vacations throughout the course of a year, and they'd be going to different places. They might use one vacation to travel to another country, another one to just decompress. And that just sounds not even amazing. It just sounds logical. I don't know, to me it just sounds like common sense. But hey, common sense isn't so common these days, hence me making this video. Now, the next thing that sucks about American workplace culture, working culture in general, is the amount of sick days you get. Now this right here kind of trips me out because I honestly didn't really know about this. I don't know if this applies to the jobs that I used to work. I worked in the service industry. I never worked at a salaried job before. But basically, it's my understanding that here in the US, a lot of jobs offer a limited number of sick days. So in other words, if you get sick more than the allotted amount of time that they give you for being sick, then you get penalized in some way, shape, or form. I don't know exactly what the penalty or punishment would be, but in Europe, that does not exist. In Europe, I believe, just based on my understanding, that it's standard to have unlimited sick days, which, I mean, well, that's common sense, right? You can't control if you get sick. Obviously, you can do your due diligence, you can wash your hands, you can try to avoid super crowded areas, things of that nature. But, I mean, I don't really understand that. I don't really understand the ethical grounds for having a limited number of sick days for your employees. Obviously, there are people who abuse that idea of taking a sick day to do something else. I've done that as well when I worked. But hey, maybe, just maybe, if you offered people longer vacations, they wouldn't have to do that. I don't know. I'm just speculating, but I mean, if people had a month off, a month of paid vacation instead of a week or two, maybe they wouldn't feel as compelled to abuse their sick days. But again, aside from that, people legitimately get sick. And I don't see why people should be penalized for getting sick. It just doesn't make any sense. Again, what are the ethical grounds for having that sort of limitation? That should be illegal, in my opinion. Out of everything I've spoken about, okay, we can talk about vacation, at-will employment, all of that. This right here is the one that sticks out to me the most. This sticks out to me the most. I honestly didn't even know about this when I dropped out, but had I known about this, I probably would have never went to college in the first place, because this is just absolutely ridiculous. Now, I know I've been speaking very negatively about American workplace culture throughout this video, and that is for good reason. It's because they do need to improve. Because again, at the end of the day, the majority of people in any given society, American, European, it doesn't matter, the majority of people are not going to be talking to a camera for a living. The majority of people are going to be clocking into a job and clocking out at the end of the day. So this is something that the US needs to address. However, I do want to share one thing that I do find as somewhat of a positive in American workplace culture. And I think this is more indicative of Americans' mindsets overall. And that is workplace mobility. So, and actually, you know what? I say it's a positive, but there are positive and negative aspects to this one difference. So it's all about your individual perspective. But just hear me out on this, okay? Workplace mobility is a lot different in the US than it is in Europe. And what I mean by that, and again, I apologize for any wind noise you might hear. I literally cannot control it. Texas wind is just crazy, especially this time of the year. But here in the US, basically, it is not uncommon for people to up and move across the whole entire country in search of better opportunities because they have a job offer in that place. So you might have spent your whole entire life in New York, for example. You grew up in New York, your family's all in New York, your friends are all in New York, your whole entire social ecosystem is in New York. But upon finishing college, you receive a job offer in California, all the way across the country. That's a 5 to 6 hour flight away. Just for context, it's about the same distance as New York City to Ireland. Just about, at least by plane. It's not uncommon for people to take that position. What I found in Europe, at least just based on my observations, is that people prioritize community over opportunity. And again, this isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just indicative of a general difference in the mindsets of Americans and Europeans, that is. Because here, opportunity is not the end-all be-all, but it is the driving force for most people's decision-making process. And I'm no exception to that, honestly. I'm no real exception to that. Me moving to Europe was driven by community. I just wanted to be with my girlfriend. But at the same time, I acknowledged that there was going to be an opportunity for me if I wanted to take it. The opportunity being covering the differences between the US and Europe on my YouTube channel. So in a sense, you could argue that my move to Europe and me even being credible to make these kinds of videos was in part driven by this component of my American psyche, so to speak. But again, I don't think this is necessarily a good or bad thing. I think that there's somewhere in the middle that I've personally sought out. There's this sort of balance between seeking out community and opportunity that I think I've done a pretty good job of finding, at least up to this point in my life. But I do think that in the US, a lot of people tend to completely disregard community in search of opportunity. And I also don't think that this is a coincidence. I think that this is in large part because of who Americans descend from. If you think about the US, just the demographics of the US, literally this whole country is just immigrants. Okay, other than Native Americans, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of this country is immigrants or descendants of immigrants. I myself am no exception to this. And what you need to understand about this is that people came here because of the opportunity. They left their community in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in South America, wherever people came from, to the US to essentially shift the trajectory of their bloodline, so to speak. They came here in search of opportunity because there was no community here in the early days. Just like any other newfound land. And of course, it wasn't really newfound, but different discussion for a different day. People came here in search of opportunity, and I believe that that mindset has been passed down from generation to generation. And that's why Americans will literally just at the drop of a hat move across the country, or even move to a different country or a different continent than the one that they're accustomed to being in search of opportunity. It's because that's what we all descend from. That's what all of us descend from. But also, I think that from a European standpoint, this is a lot less practical for most Europeans because the cultural barriers, the cultural learning curve can be so much more substantial when you're moving from, let's say, the Netherlands to France than it is moving from New York City to California. Even though the physical distance is not nearly as vast, the fact that they speak a different language, they have different cultural customs, and just overall a different way of approaching life, that makes it much more difficult to have that workplace mobility. And I do see that being a great deterrent for European workers.